Hello, class, and welcome to part two of the read along for Virginia Held's Feminist Transformations of Moral Theory. In this part, we will be looking at the first section, the first big section on the history of ethics. I know this is a very long section, but a lot of that is contextualizing and Held building a very strong case for her particular argument. So really what we're looking at is the core of the argument itself, and that shouldn't take us too long to get through. Remember that in this section, Held is trying to show that, as she puts it in this sentence up here, various fundamental aspects of the history of ethics have not been gender neutral. That is, important ideas in how ethical theory has been constructed uh, have been developed not as gender neutral ideas, but as male centered ideas. And in the history of ethics section, she's trying to show this by referring to lots of historical philosophers and their views on ethics. A very important um, part to understanding her main idea here is this sentence. The split between reason and emotion is one of the most familiar of philosophical conceptions. So throughout the history of philosophy, human beings have been seen as composed of at least two kind of mental ideas: reason, logical thought on one hand, and emotion, desire on the other. This goes all the way back to the pre-Socratics, where we have been seen as, kind of conflict, beings in conflict between reason and emotion. So this is a fairly uncontroversial claim to anybody familiar with the history of philosophy. But what Held wants to do, and what she goes on to do in this section, is saying that in the history of philosophy, in the history of ethics in particular, reason has been associated with the masculine, and emotion has been associated with the feminine, which I think intuitively makes sense to us if we just see how our culture talks about women as being overly emotional or being tied to emotion, and men as being the reasonable, logical, colder gender. So as Hell continues, she goes back to Plato and Aristotle to show that in these Greek philosophers, this split happened, although it was usually associated or kind of called the form and matter, where one was the emotional female and the other form was more important, better, uh, active, and determinate, as she says there. So these associations between reason and maleness, and between femaleness and emotion, with the hierarchy of reason being better, have persisted throughout the history of philosophical thought, says Held, and in particular kind of manifest themselves in how we have talked about ethical concepts. This leads her to say ethics has been, not as it is claimed to be, a search for the universal, but a gender-biased enterprise, the one biased toward the men or toward the male. In the next part, she elaborates on this distinction, this historical distinction between uh, masculine and feminine, or between reason and emotion, but also bringing up another important distinction that has dominated ethical and philosophical discussions for a long time, the distinction between the public and the private. So in public, that's the where we debate. That's government. That's the social. That's where reason is most needed and most used. And many philosophers go on to claim that that is where we become sort of fully human. Right? It's our reason that makes us fully human, and we are able to most demonstrate that reason in the public sphere. The private sphere is the home, the family, in the raising of children. That is seen as natural, right? Because even animals do that stuff, right? Animals have to raise children. Animals have to take care of each other. Animals have their own, homes that they build and take care of. So she kind of elevates this distinction, where on one hand she wants to say reason has been associated with maleness, and that has been associated with the public. And on the other side, we have emotion being associated with feminine, and that has been associated with the private. Where that leads us, or where that leads us to say, is that you know what we what philosophers have come to see as making us human is reason, which has been associated with the male side of things, right? So it's reason that we have that animals do not, um, and reason that's been typically associated with men. And so men end up becoming, in her argument, like the only fully human sort of half of the species, right? That women are seen by many philosophers as being not fully human because they're not fully rational. They're held too much by their emotional side. And she says it right here, right? I mean, women have been seen as emotional rather than rational beings, and thus as incapable of full moral personhood. Women's behavior is natural, driven by instinct, and so it doesn't, or they are unable to sort of fully construct the rational principles that morality ought to depend on. So that's really the core of this part, right? Which is that the association of reason with our full humanity and with maleness, and the association of emotion with women and kind of the more natural or not fully human or not as good parts of our nature. Most of the remainder of this section is held showing that this is true in particular philosophers' work. So Rousseau, Kant, Hegel, Hobbes, all of these people take the rational as being the way in which we're fully human, and reason as being the basis for human morality, and in various ways rank the emotional or the aesthetic or the familial as less than the rational. And if you take, the emotional as being associated with women, what is implicit in those old philosophical arguments is that women are somehow not as rational or have a harder time becoming moral than men are. So she concludes this section by pointing out that there are many different types of feminist thought, and not all feminists agree on everything. And so, how the moral theory, how moral philosophy is going to proceed by incorporating feminist thought, or how feminists want moral philosophy to proceed, isn't clear because there are still lots of differences of opinion, and incorporating the feminist thought will take more than just some revision around the margins. Held thinks it will require a significant revision of moral philosophy. Um, and then she begins to transition into the remainder of the article by showing um, how contemporary feminists are kind of redefining or transforming some key parts of moral philosophy, some key ideas in moral philosophy. And so they begin with reason and emotion, and then they go on to a couple of others, which we'll talk about in the next part.